The tuxedo was delivered on a Friday, encased in a garment bag so heavy and black it felt like a body bag for his soul. Kim Do-jun didn't need to see the monogram to know who had ordered it. That particular shade of midnight wool, the one that whispered of forced traditions and cold-blooded alliances, was Rachel Lee's signature. He unzipped it with a hand that had pulled triggers more often than it had held champagne flutes, the silk lining smooth against his scarred knuckles. The event was just as obscene. A wedding that was less a union of hearts and more a consolidation of territories between two warring syndicates. The ceremony was in 2 hours. It was not a celebration of love. It was a surrender of his autonomy. A final public display to show the underworld that the Dragon of Soul had finally been caged. Do-jun stood before his floor-to-ceiling mirror, the dragon tattoo on his neck peeking out from a collar that felt like a noose. His penthouse, 50 floors above the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, was a sanctuary of minimalist violence, all cold marble and hidden safes. But the wedding was a breach in his defenses, a death sentence disguised as a sacred vow. He felt a familiar numbness settle in his chest, the precise, tactical coldness that had made him the most feared man in the city, the kind of man who dealt in blood so others could deal in branding. Rachel wasn't his choice, she was his duty. Their marriage was a treaty, not a romance, but the stillness was the problem. They expected him to play the part of the dutiful soldier, to stand at the altar like a statue while the Lee family absorbed his legacy. A silent pawn at his own execution. He looked at his reflection. No, he would not be a pawn. He would be the catalyst. He needed a disruption, something, or someone, to shatter the sterile, murderous peace of the Shilla ballroom. He needed a wild card. He found her amidst the chaos of the catering kitchen, a waitress named Maya Davies. She moved with a defiant grace, her eyes sharp and utterly unimpressed by the armed guards lurking in the corridors. She was a vision of vibrant life in a room full of ghosts. While the other staff bowed their heads, she held hers high, a silent master of her own space. In that moment, as she balanced a tray of crystal flutes with the poise of a queen, his reckless plan crystallized. She wasn't just a waitress. She was the beautiful, dangerous disruption he needed to burn the whole gallery down. Before we continue, please like and subscribe. It's very important. Comment your name and where you are watching from. Maya Davies smoothed her apron, the stiff fabric a reminder of her role as a ghost in the machine of high society Seoul. In the grand ballroom of the Shilla, she was less than a person. She was a pair of moving hands, a shadow in a navy vest designed to blend into the velvet curtains. She moved between the VIP tables with a silver tray, navigating a sea of vultures in tuxedos who picked at their plates while whispering of market shares and blood feuds. The air was thick with the scent of white lilies and the metallic, unspoken tension of a city on the brink of a corporate war. She paused near the front, pouring a vintage Bordeaux for a man whose eyes were as cold as the ice bucket at his elbow. From this vantage point, she could see him. Kim Do-jun, the Dragon of Soul, stood near the altar, a man built from calculated anger and fortress-like control. The dark ink of a dragon curled aggressively around his throat, a stark, violent contrast to the pristine white of his dress shirt. But Maya didn't see the monster the tabloids feared. She saw a man whose posture was a shield forged in a world that constantly underestimated him. He looked suffocated. Every time Rachel Lee leaned in, her lace gown rustling like a shroud, Maya saw the flicker of loneliness in his eyes. It was a look she recognized, the weariness of someone who had spent their life performing for an audience that only wanted to see them bleed or bow. Do-jun held a champagne glass like a weapon he wasn't allowed to fire, his jaw tight with a dangerous stillness. Maya caught his reflection in the polished marble of a nearby pillar. While the elite around them traded glass shards of gossip, Do-jun remained in a violent silence, his gaze fixed on nothingness. He was the most powerful man in the room, yet he appeared as a hostage in a merger he never asked for. As she moved to clear a stray napkin, their eyes met for a fraction of a second, a moment of truth that cut through the performative civility of the ballroom. In that heartbeat, the invisible girl saw the caged dragon, and for the first time that night, the coldness in Do-jun's chest felt a crack in the facade. He wasn't just a boss. He was a man waiting for a wild card to burn the gilded cage to the ground. The air in the private antechamber of the Shilla Hotel was frigid, stripped of the artificial warmth blooming in the ballroom below. Kim Do-jun stood by the window, his silhouette a sharp, dark edge against the gray Seoul skyline. He reached up to adjust his tie, his fingers grazing the dragon tattoo that climbed his throat, a mark of a life lived in violent silence and shadows. The silence of the room was shattered by the rhythmic, predatory click of heels against marble. Rachel Lee entered, her lace gown rustling like a shroud, and trailing behind her like a closing curtain. She didn't approach him with the tenderness of a bride. She moved with the calculated anger of a general inspecting a conquered territory. Stopping just inches from his back, she caught his reflection in the glass, her own face a mask of glass that hid a cold fury. She reached out, her gloved hand smoothing the shoulder of his tuxedo with a gesture that felt more like a brand than a caress. "The guests are seated, Du-jun," she whispered, her voice carrying the sibilant hiss of a viper. He didn't turn, his gaze remaining fixed on the indifferent lights of the city. When he remained silent, her grip tightened, her manicured nails digging into the expensive wool. "Do not mistake this for a romance. We are not here for sacred vows or private truths. This is a hostage exchange between monsters, a merger of blood that our fathers brokered to end a war." She stepped around to face him, her eyes hard and calculating as they searched for any sign of rebellion in his fortress of quiet control. "Your empire was built in shadows, and mine was built on branding, but today they become one," she reminded him, her tone laced with venom. "If you think of wavering, remember that the Lee Syndicate doesn't accept regret or abdication. You are the dragon of soul only as long as you wear this ring. Try to fly away, and I will be the one to clip your wings." Du-jun finally looked down at her, his expression unreadable and impassive. The dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse with a hidden fire, a crack in the facade of his forced obedience. Rachel gave him one last, brittle smile before turning toward the door. "This isn't a choice, Du-jun, it's a command performance. Now come and play your part before the vultures get restless." She left him alone in the vast, echoing space, the weight of her final warning hanging in the air like a declaration of war. The grand ballroom was a cathedral of clinical exercise and suppressed violence. As the ceremony reached its peak, the officiant's voice droned on, a rhythmic declaration of war disguised as a religious rite. Then came the traditional pause, the speak now portion, a moment that was meant to be a formality in a room full of people too terrified to breathe, let alone object. The silence that followed was bone-thick and heavy, a fortress of quiet control that felt like it was crushing the lungs of everyone present. Maya stood at the periphery, her fingers trembling slightly as she held a crystal decanter of vintage red. She was watching Du-jun's face. It was a mask of glass, but she could see the unsettling authenticity of his pain. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a sharp scalpel, waiting for the final twist of the knife. In her haste to look away from his piercing gaze, her sleeve caught the edge of a floral arrangement. The decanter tilted, and a splash of deep, blood-colored wine bloomed across her white apron, a stark white rectangle now stained by a spectacular mistake. The sound of the glass clinking against the tray was a tactical nuclear strike in the absolute silence. Heads turned, the ballroom of vipers seeking a victim to humiliate. Rachel Lee's eyes snapped toward Maya with a look of calculated anger that promised a slow death. But as the guards began to move, it was Maya who seized the moment. She saw the noose tightening around Du-jun's neck and Rachel's mask of glass triumph. With a liquid grace that bypassed all logic, Maya didn't just apologize. She stepped out of the shadows. She walked straight to the altar, her fearless eyes locking onto Du-jun's violent silence. She didn't wait for permission. She reached out, her fingers brushing the ink of the dragon on his neck, and she pulled the most powerful man in Seoul down by the lapels of his midnight tuxedo. The black waitress kissed the Korean Mafia boss at his own wedding. It was performative civility. It was a strategic gamble that shattered the sterile composure of the Shilla Hotel. The gasp from the audience was a low murmur of discreet power, turning into a roar of scandal. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Then the Ice Queen bride's silence broke, and the ballroom of vipers prepared to strike. The silence that followed the kiss was not peaceful. It was the pressurized stillness of a bomb bay doors opening. Rachel Lee stood frozen at the altar, her face contorting from a mask of glass into a jagged, unrecognizable snarl of calculated anger. The public humiliation was a final public twist of the knife, but this time, the blade was in the hands of a waitress. To Rachel, Maya was not a woman, but a stain on the ivory and gold perfection of her dynasty's branding. Her white lace gown, which moments ago had whispered of old money and new arrogance, now seemed to pulse with a sibilant hiss of impending slaughter. Rachel didn't scream. She didn't weep. Instead, she raised a gloved hand, her fingers snapping with the liquid grace of a predator. It was a declaration of war disguised as a celebration of love. At that signal, the ballroom of vipers shed its performative civility. The men in the vultures' tuxedos didn't scatter. They reached into the shadows of their jackets. From the balconies of the Shilla, the metallic tang of sliding bolts echoed like a tactical nuclear strike. This union was a treaty, Rachel said, her voice a shiver of ice that cut through the low murmur of the crowd. She looked at Du-jun, then leveled a gaze of pure, unadulterated pride at Maya. And treaties are written in blood. With a flick of her wrist toward her father's lead enforcer, she turned the wedding into a kill zone. The bone-thick pillars of the ballroom suddenly felt like the only sanctuary in a world turned to chrome and smoked glass. Rachel took a step back, her mask of glass, resetting into a look of clinical exercise as she watched her guards level their weapons. The Dragon of Soul had sought a disruption, a wild card to shatter the gilded cage, but Rachel was prepared to burn the cage with everyone inside it. "Execution is my wedding gift to you," she whispered, her eyes steady and unblinking. As the first red laser sight found the stark white rectangle of Maya's apron, the air in the ballroom turned to fire, and the hostage exchange between monsters officially became a massacre. The atmosphere in the ballroom curdled, the clinical exercise of a wedding transforming into the cold mechanics of an assassination. Rachel Lee stood amidst the white lilies like a statue of salt, her voice a shiver of ice that cut through the panicked breathing of the crowd. She didn't look like a jilted bride. She looked like a surgeon with a scalpel, ready to excise a tumor. Her gaze fixed on Maya, seeing not a human being, but a crack in the facade of her family's absolute branding. To Rachel, the kiss wasn't just an act of passion. It was an act of high treason by a peasant that had to be answered in lead. "Execution is a wedding gift," Rachel murmured, the words falling like polished bone against the marble floor. She turned her head slightly toward her father's lead enforcer, her expression a mask of glass that betrayed no mercy. The humiliation was the point, and the only way to rewrite the game back in her favor was to let the red bloom across Maya's white apron. "Restore our face," she commanded, her tone perfectly even and devoid of heat. "Kill her, now!" The order was the tactical nuclear strike that ended the charade of civility. Around the room, the vultures in tuxedos stepped back, clearing a path for the shooters who moved with liquid grace. Laser sights, like thin red veins, began to dance across the stark white rectangle of the catering station where Maya stood. The Dragon of Soul had sought a wild card, a disruption to shatter the gilded cage, but Rachel had decided to turn that cage into a ballroom of vipers, where no one escaped alive. Maya felt the metallic tang of fear in the back of her throat, her fearless eyes finally widening as the weight of the merger of blood became a physical reality. She was a vision of poised professionalism, suddenly cast as the lead in a command performance of death. As the enforcers leveled their suppressed weapons, Rachel watched with calculated anger, her hands folded over her lace gown, as if waiting for a ceremony of love to conclude. She didn't just want Maya dead. She wanted the unsettling authenticity of Maya's life to be snuffed out before the first course was even served. The Dragon of Soul finally exhaled, a sound like a shiver of ice, breaking under the weight of a decade's worth of restraint. As the first red laser sight found the stark white rectangle of Maya's apron, Kim Do-jun moved with a liquid grace that was no longer performative. He didn't just step toward her. He became a fortress of quiet control in motion, closing the distance before the lead enforcer's finger could complete its tactical nuclear strike. He threw his arm around Maya, pulling her flush against the midnight wool of his chest, shielding her fearless heart with his own. For the first time since the ceremony began, Du-jun broke his vow of silence. His voice didn't rise to a shout. It was a clear and low vibration that cut through the blooming chaos of the ballroom. "Touch her," he said, the words sharper than a surgeon's scalpel. "And I burn this gilded cage to the ground with every one of you inside it." The vultures in tuxedos gasped as Du-jun reached into the shadows of his impeccably tailored suit. With a fluid, calculated anger, He discarded the facade of the submissive groom. From the hidden holsters beneath the silk lining, the weapons he had carried into his own wedding like private truths, he drew twin semi-automatics. The chrome and leather of the firearms caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, a declaration of war that silenced even Rachel Lee's sibilant hiss. He stood at the center of the ballroom of vipers, his thumb grazing the ink on his neck as he leveled his sights at Rachel's father. The dragon tattoo seemed to pulse with a dangerous stillness, no longer a mark of a caged beast, but a warning of a predator unleashed. Du-jun wasn't just a shadow detaching itself from the corner anymore. He was the main event. He looked down at Maya, his unsettling authenticity finally visible in the way he tightened his grip on her shoulder. "I told you I was a master of control," he whispered, his eyes steady and unblinking as the first shots of the Lee Syndicate's guards pinged against the marble pillars. "Now I'm going to show you how I handle a hostage exchange." With a reckless, strategic gamble, he pivoted, his calculated anger turning into a spectacular display of violence. The first tactical nuclear strike of gunfire shattered the crystal chandeliers, raining glass shards like diamonds onto the bloody ivory and gold carpet. The ballroom of vipers had devolved into a cacophony of screaming socialites and the rhythmic, violent silence of suppressed muzzles. Du-jun moved with a liquid grace that defied the laws of physics, his body a living shield for Maya as he returned fire, his chrome and leather weapons barking with calculated anger. But as they reached the edge of the dais, a shiver of ice ran through Maya, a bloom of dried blood was spreading across Du-jun's midnight tuxedo. He had taken a hit to the shoulder, his fortress of quiet control finally showing a crack in the facade. "This way," Maya hissed, her fearless eyes scanning the sea of roses and revolvers for an exit. She wasn't a guest. She was the invisible girl who had spent months memorizing the shadows of this hotel. She grabbed Du-jun's hand, his skin cold against hers, and pulled him toward a heavy velvet curtain that led to the service entrance. Behind them, Rachel Lee's voice rose in a sibilant hiss, ordering her vultures to close the perimeter. They burst into the service corridor, a stark white rectangle of fluorescent lights and industrial steel that smelled of metallic tang and floor wax. This was Maya's domain, a panoramic labyrinth of smoked glass doors and freight elevators that the elite never saw. Du-jun leaned heavily against her, his breath coming in labored, violent silences, the dragon tattoo on his neck slick with sweat. "The main elevators are a trap," she whispered, her poised professionalism morphing into a survival instinct. She led him through the clinical maze of the laundry chutes and staff stairwells, bypassing the armed guards who were rushing toward the ballroom. Every click of heels in the distance was a declaration of war, but Maya moved with the liquid grace of a ghost. She knew which doors were corked and which led to the neon freedom of the streets. As they reached the sub-basement, the muffled roar of the ballroom massacre felt like a distant spectacle. Maya stripped off her wine-stained apron, using the stark white fabric to bind Du-jun's wound, her touch a private truth in a world of fake relationships. He looked at her then, his unsettling authenticity mirroring her own. The dragon of soul was bleeding. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. The industrial kitchen was a landscape of stainless steel and smoked glass, now cast in the flickering emergency red of the hotel's alarm system. The clatter of plates had been replaced by the distant, rhythmic pop of gunfire and the hiss of a ruptured steam line. Maya pulled Du-jun behind a heavy prep island, his weight sagging against her as the dried blood on his tuxedo darkened to the color of the Bordeaux she had served earlier. They were cornered, the only exit blocked by the vultures closing in, but for a heartbeat, the ballroom of vipers felt worlds away. Du-jun leaned his head back against the cold metal, his breath a labored, violent silence. The dragon tattoo on his neck was slick with the sweat of a man who had spent his life in a fortress of quiet control and was finally watching the walls crumble. He looked at Maya, really looked at her, without the performative civility of the elite or the mask of glass he wore for his enemies. "You should have left the tray and run," he rasped, his voice a shiver of ice softened by a moment of truth. Maya tightened the makeshift bandage on his shoulder, her fearless eyes meeting his. "I don't leave people behind in a kill zone, especially not after I'm the one who started the fire." He reached out with his uninjured hand, his fingers cold against her skin as he touched the wine stain on her shoulder. A small, wry smile touched his lips. Rachel thinks I'm the one who chose you. She thinks I'm a fool for a reckless, strategic gamble of the heart. He shook his head slowly. But you were the one who moved first, Maya. You didn't just burn my legacy, you blew up the entire command performance of my life. He looked around the sterile, clinical kitchen, then back to the unsettling authenticity in her gaze. I didn't save you because you kissed me. I saved you because for the 10 minutes you were at my table, I forgot I was a ghost. You were the only light in a world built on shadows and branding. You were real, and they are all just ivory and gold lies. The sound of boots echoed in the service corridor, a declaration of war that meant their time was up. Maya felt the metallic tang of the end, but the fearless energy in her chest had shifted. It was no longer about survival. It was about the private truth they had found. The back exit of the Shilla swung open, vomiting them out into a night that had turned into a panorama of indifferent lights and torrential rain. The soul sky didn't just weep. It hammered against the pavement, a liquid grace that washed the dried blood from Du-jun's hands and the wine from Maya's ruined uniform. Behind them, the hotel was a fortress of quiet control, no longer. Its ivory and gold halls stained by a ballroom massacre that would rewrite the city's history. But as the heavy steel door clicked shut, the muffled screams and tactical nuclear strikes of gunfire faded into the rhythmic drumming of the storm. Du-jun stumbled, his midnight wool tuxedo heavy with water and his own private truth, but Maya caught him. She didn't look back at the gilded cage they had escaped. She led him toward the neon glow of a side street, where the flickering signs of ramen shops cast red and blue reflections on the slick asphalt. In the vast echoing space of the city, they were no longer a mafia boss and a prop. They were just two silhouettes detaching themselves from a dying world. He stopped under the buzzing glow of a green neon sign, his breath a labored, violent silence. He reached up, his fingers trembling as he touched the dragon tattoo on his neck. To the world, that ink was a declaration of war, a symbol of the dragon of soul who ruled the shadows. But in the unsettling authenticity of the rain, it looked like nothing more than a scar. He looked at Maya, his mask of glass shattered beyond repair. You played the part perfectly, he rasped, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips despite the pain. Maya leaned against the brick wall, the adrenaline finally cooling. You said you were a master of control, Du-jun, but when you approached me in that kitchen 3 hours ago and told me the plan, I didn't think you'd actually let me go through with it. The memory flashed between them, the shadow detaching itself from the kitchen corner before the ceremony, the black envelope he hadn't needed to offer because she had already seen the loneliness in his eyes. He had told her then, I need a disruption. I need the world to see me as untouchable, and then I need you to prove them wrong. When the efficient asks, don't just speak, act. The kiss wasn't just a disruption, Du-jun whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. It was the only way to make Rachel pull the trigger first. I needed her to break the treaty so I could walk away with a clean slate. Maya looked at her hands, still shaking from the reckless, strategic gamble she had taken when she pulled him down to her at the altar. She realized her life as an invisible girl was over. That version of her had been publicly neutered by the violence of the night. But as she looked into Du-jun, steady and unblinking eyes, she realized the truth. The kiss was planned, but the light she felt when their lips met, the unsettling authenticity of it, that had been the only thing they hadn't rehearsed. Her life as a survivor had just begun. She hailed a taxi, the yellow light cutting through the smoked glass of the rain. As they slid into the back seat, disappearing into the glittering sprawl of the city, the humiliation the Lee family intended had become a spectacular victory. They vanished into the dark, two ghosts finally choosing their own terms. Thank you for watching till the end. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. You are valuable to us. See you in the next story.